When a nun fell in love with a woman, Sister Margaret had spent 17 years behind the walls of St. Catherine's convent, her days measured in prayers, and her nights filled with whispered conversations with God. She had given her life to service, to devotion, to a higher calling that demanded everything and promised peace in return. But on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, when she met Dr. Elena Santos in the convent's garden, something shifted in the carefully ordered universe she had built around her heart. Elena had come to volunteer at the convent's medical clinic, her dark eyes warm with compassion as she treated the elderly sisters and the neighborhood children who came seeking care. Margaret watched from a distance at first, organizing supplies and filing paperwork, telling herself that the flutter in her chest was simply admiration for someone doing God's work in the world. But when their hands touched over a box of bandages, when Elena smiled and said her name sounded like a prayer, Margaret felt something crack open inside her that she had sealed shut when she took her vows at 23 years old. The weeks that followed were torture disguised as blessing. Elena came every Tuesday and Thursday, her presence filling the stark clinic rooms with laughter and life. She talked about her patients with genuine tenderness, about the communities she had served in rural villages across Latin America, about her belief that healing was a sacred act, whether performed in a hospital or a humble clinic. Margaret found herself inventing reasons to be near her, to hear her voice, to exist in the same space where the air seemed charged with possibility. They began having lunch together in the garden, sharing simple meals of bread and soup while Elena told stories that made Margaret laugh in ways she had forgotten were possible. And Margaret, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, found herself sharing pieces of her own story, the girl she had been before the veil, the dreams she had buried beneath layers of duty and devotion. But with every conversation, every shared glance, every moment when their knees touched as they sat side by side on the garden bench, Margaret felt the weight of her commitment pressing down on her like stones. She had made promises before God and the church, had dedicated her life to a path that left no room for the feelings blooming, wild and desperate in her heart. At night she knelt in her cell and prayed for strength, for clarity, for the confusion to pass like a fever. She begged forgiveness for thoughts she could barely admit to herself, for the way she imagined what it might feel like to hold Elena's hand not in greeting but in love, to wake up beside her and build a life that existed outside these walls. The guilt was suffocating, but it paled in comparison to the loneliness that had always lived in the corners of her devotion. The questions she had never allowed herself to ask about whether she had chosen this life or simply hidden in it. Sister Catherine, the eldest nun in the convent and Margaret's mentor since her novitiate, noticed the change before anyone else. She found Margaret one evening in the chapel, tears streaming silently down her face as she stared at the statue of Mary, and she sat beside her without speaking for a long time. When Margaret finally broke, when the words tumbled out in desperate confession about Elena and the feelings she could no longer deny, Sister Catherine took her hand and held it, with the gentleness of someone who had lived long enough to understand that love comes in many forms and grace appears in unexpected places. She told Margaret about her own struggle decades ago, about the woman she had loved before entering the convent, about the choice she had made and whether it had been the right one. She said that God's love was bigger than the boxes humans tried to put it in, and that perhaps the real sin was not in feeling love but in denying the truth of your own heart. The revelation shook something loose in Margaret. For days she walked through her duties in a daze, moving between prayer and service while her mind spiraled through every possibility and consequence. She thought about leaving the convent, about the life she might build outside these walls. But the fear was paralyzing. This place had been her home, her identity, her entire world for 17 years. The sisters were her family. The rhythm of prayers and service was the only structure she knew. Who would she be without the veil, without the safety of this calling? And yet when she saw Elena, when she allowed herself to really look at the woman who had awakened something she thought was dead, she couldn't imagine going back to the numbness that had been her companion for so long. She couldn't imagine a life where she never explored what this feeling might become, where she died wondering what she had been too afraid to reach for. Elena, perceptive and gentle, began to sense the turmoil radiating from Margaret. One Thursday afternoon, as they cleaned the clinic after the last patient had gone, she asked if something was wrong, if she had done anything to cause distress. Margaret, her hands trembling as she folded gauze, found herself unable to lie. The words came out broken and halting, an admission that she had feelings that went against everything she was supposed to be, feelings that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She expected Elena to pull away, to be uncomfortable or to offer kind but distant reassurance. Instead, Elena set down the supplies she was holding and stepped closer, her eyes shining with something that looked like hope and sadness intertwined. She confessed that she had felt it too, from the first day, that she had tried to ignore it out of respect for Margaret's vows, but that every moment with her had become precious beyond measure. The confession hung between them in the quiet clinic, heavy with implications that neither could take back. Elena reached out slowly, giving Margaret every chance to move away, and cupped her face with one hand. The touch was electric, more intimate than any prayer, and Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks as she leaned into it. Elena whispered that she would never ask Margaret to choose, that she understood the magnitude of what the vows meant, but that she needed Margaret to know she was loved exactly as she was, in all her complexity and contradiction. That moment, with Elena's hand warm against her skin and the late afternoon light streaming through the clinic windows, was both the most beautiful and most devastating experience of Margaret's life, because she knew that pretending anymore would be impossible, that the door had been opened and she could not unknow what her heart was capable of feeling. The next weeks were agonizing as Margaret wrestled with a decision that felt impossible from every angle. She spent hours in the chapel, seeking divine guidance that came only in whispers and intuition. She talked with Sister Catherine, who reminded her that God had given humans free will and the capacity for love, and that perhaps the most faithful thing she could do was honor the truth rather than hide from it. She thought about the teenagers who came to the clinic, the ones struggling with their own identities, and how she had always told them that they were beloved, children of God exactly as they were. Could she offer them acceptance while denying it to herself? Could she preach about truth and courage while living a lie? The questions circled endlessly, but beneath them, one truth pulsed steady and certain. She loved Elena, and that love felt more sacred than any obligation that demanded its denial. When Margaret finally made her decision, it came not as a dramatic revelation but as a quiet acceptance, like finally exhaling after holding her breath for 17 years. She requested a meeting with the Mother Superior and, with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face, asked to be released from her vows. The process would be long and complicated, she was told, involving petitions and dispensations and questions about her state of mind. But Mother Superior, who had known Margaret since she was a young woman seeking refuge from a world that felt too big and too harsh, looked at her with something like understanding. She asked if Margaret was certain, if she had prayed on this decision, if she understood what she would be leaving behind. Margaret nodded, her voice steady despite the tears, and said that she had prayed more in the past months than in her entire religious life, and that she believed with her whole heart that this was what she was being called to do, even if it terrified her. The process of leaving took months, each step feeling like peeling away layers of identity that had defined her for so long. She worked with a therapist who specialized in religious transitions, processing the grief of leaving a life she had loved. Even as she moved toward one that felt more authentically hers, Elena waited patiently, never pushing, showing up at the convent clinic every week even after Margaret's role there changed, offering steady presence and quiet support. The other sisters had mixed reactions. Some were supportive, hugging Margaret and promising prayers for her journey. Others were distant, confused by a choice they couldn't understand. Sister Catherine remained her anchor, reminding her that courage often looks like confusion before it crystallizes into clarity, and that the divine works through all forms of love. On a spring morning almost exactly 1 year after she had first met Elena, Margaret walked out of St. Catherine's convent for the last time as a sister. She wore simple civilian clothes that felt strange against her skin, and she carried a small bag containing the few personal possessions she had accumulated over 17 years. Elena was waiting in a car parked down the street. Respecting Margaret's need to walk through the gates alone, to mark the threshold between the life she was leaving and the one she was choosing. When Margaret slid into the passenger seat, Elena took her hand without speaking, and they sat there for a long moment, both of them crying, both of them terrified, both of them more certain than they had ever been that love, in whatever form it takes, is always worth the courage it demands. If this story has touched something in your heart, if you've ever struggled with choosing between duty and truth, or if you believe that love transcends the boundaries we try to build around it, please take a moment to like this video and share it. Stories like Margaret's matter because they remind us that the most faithful thing we can do is honor who we truly are. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them. Margaret and Elena built a life together slowly, with intention and care. Margaret worked through the grief of leaving her religious community, while also discovering parts of herself she had never known existed. She found work at a non-profit serving homeless populations. Channeling her years of service into a new form of devotion, Elena continued her medical work, and together they created a home filled with books and laughter and the kind of quiet joy that comes from being fully seen and fully loved. They faced judgment from some quarters, from people who couldn't understand how someone could leave God for a person, though Margaret would always gently correct them. She hadn't left God, she would say. She had simply learned that the divine was bigger than the institutions built to contain it, and that authentic love was itself a form of prayer. The guilt never fully disappeared. The grief for the life and sisters she had left behind remained tender, but alongside it grew a gratitude for the courage to choose truth over comfort, for the gift of Elena's patient love, for the discovery that she could be both faithful and free. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something from the heart. If Margaret's journey resonated with you, if you know what it's like to wrestle with impossible choices or to discover parts of yourself you were taught to hide, please leave a comment below. Share a word of encouragement or simply write courage if this story moved you. Your words create a community for everyone walking a difficult path. Years later, Margaret would return to St. Catherine's as a visitor, bringing Elena to meet the sisters who had shaped her life. Sister Catherine, now elderly and frail, would hold both their hands and say a blessing over them, recognizing their love as holy. And Margaret, standing in the garden where she had first felt her heart open, would understand that she had never actually left her faith behind. She had simply grown large enough to contain a more expansive version of it, one that made room for all the forms of love that make us human, that make us brave, that make us whole.